It appears the U.S. is changing its policy in Syria. On Friday, U.S. troops began conducting military exercises in the southern part of the country where the U.S. has a presence. Well, Russians have recently threatened to enter the area, allegedly to pursue what they call our terrorists. Well, last week, Russians also launched airstrikes on the northern province of Idlib. That's the last major rebel-held territory in the country. President Trump and the administration have given clear warnings against the attacks, and this comes months after President Trump vowed to leave the country. Here's what he had to say back in March.
We spent, and I was against it from the beginning. They try and say, well, maybe not. I was against it from the beginning. And by the way, we're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon. Very soon we're coming out. We're going to have 100% of the caliphate, as they call it, sometimes referred to as land. We're taking it all back quickly.
But this week, the U.S. envoy for Syria, James Jeffrey, said, quote, the new policy, we are no longer pulling out by the end of the year. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Middle East Security Director at the Center for a New American Security Foundation, Ilan Goldenberg, joins us now. So, Ilan, this change appears to be, in part, a response to Iran's presence in the region. Walk us through this. What's the big concern right now?
Sure. Well, I think one of the big concerns is Iran. Iran is deeply invested in Syria, has been throughout the conflict. Because the Iranians... Sorry, go ahead.
I apologize. No. Go ahead.
Sure. Because Iran views Syria as how it basically projects out into the Levant, projects out into Lebanon, puts pressure on Israel, has invested in Hezbollah for a generation. And so what the Iranians have been doing is really the Iranians have created the ground force that has essentially become the Assad's ground force. And we're talking about 100,000 Iranian militia or so, Pakistani militia, Afghan militia, Iraqi, Syrian, Lebanese, all trained by Iran, who have basically been the key to retaking most of the country, combining Iranian ground forces with Russian air force and some support from the Assad regime itself. And so I think part of the motivation, at least for the Trump administration, is to push back on Iran. But it seems like it might just be too late for that, honestly, both based on the administration's policy for the last 15 months and the Obama administration's policy for the first few years of this conflict.
You know, we heard the Chief of Staff, General Dunford, come forward and say that they are not afraid to push forward if chemical weapons are used at this point. Do you get the sense that there will be some sort of military action taken at this point by the United States? Are we closer to intervening? And what would it mean to intervene at this point?
No, I don't think we're intervening at this point. It's too late in the game. The bottom line is, look, just a few months ago, Iran combined with Russia and the Assad regime took a large chunk of southern Syria. This was an area of the country where we actually had trained a lot of opposition forces working with Jordan and Israel, two of our closest allies. And even in that situation, and we even had a ceasefire, actually, in that situation that was negotiated by the Trump administration with the Russians that they touted as a huge success just a year ago. And the Russians and the Assad regime in Iran totally violated it, took over this entire area in the south. The U.S. talked a little bit about things, but essentially let them do it. So we're not even going to protect our closest allies. And here in the Idlib province, it's much more complicated. It's the Turks who hold parts of this territory and a lot more al-Qaeda presence in this territory. So we weren't willing to defend our partners and allies in the south. Why would anybody believe that we were going to defend al-Qaeda now against the Assad regime, Russia and Iran? I don't see it as credible.
You don't see it as credible, even though Dunford said this. I want to ask you, though, last week, we know Russia conducted these airstrikes on Idlib. Yeah. The Trump administration has made very strong warnings against these attacks. Trump himself said that the attacks were grave and a humanitarian risk. How exactly has this affected U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, thus far, it remains to be seen on that front. I mean, we need to maybe pull back for a second and talk about Idlib. Well, you might be seeing the beginning of the biggest humanitarian catastrophe of the Syrian civil war. And that's saying something for a conflict that has seen over 500,000 killed and millions displaced. Because what's been happening for the last couple of years is Assad with his allies, they've been systematically retaking different pieces of the country, one after the other. And then what do is they get to the point where it becomes inevitable that they're going to win, and they negotiate a ceasefire with the opposition. And what does the opposition do as part of that? It gets moved to Idlib. And so they've been moving and moving and moving hundreds of thousands of people into Idlib. There's no place for them to go now. If this offensive starts in a major way, you're going to see potentially huge refugee flows into Turkey and massive civilian casualties. This is why we're talking about chemical weapons, because this is such a difficult terrain that might be one way that Assad tries to actually, speed up this conflict. But, Turkey has been containing the refugee problem and keeping it out of Europe. And I think if we see this major offensive, it could start destabilizing Europe again, whole new refugee flows in crisis we haven't seen in a couple of years. And I imagine that would create new tensions in the U.S.-Russia relationship, because we don't want to see any of that.
Absolutely. People don't realize the impact. Refugees can be refugees for decades once they take that path. I want to thank you very much, Ilan Goldenberg. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.